Hello, I'm Richard Hibbitt from the University of Leeds, and I'm going to talk to you now for a few minutes about some of the ideas for my intervention in next week's virtual roundtable at Glasgow for the Scottish Fin de Siècle Cosmopolitanism project. I'm going to be talking about the concept of cosmopolitanism at the Fin de Siècle. And I want to discuss the ambivalence towards cosmopolitanism that you see amongst various literary critics during the final decades of the 19th century, but also specifically how that plays into local national debates about notions of French literature, but also about French identity, how it feeds into notions of decadence, both artistically but also in the political context of the last 3 decades of the 19th century, after the loss of the Franco-Prussian War and the failure of the Commune, or crushing of the Commune, depending on how you look at it, in 1871. So I want to think about its relationship to decadence as well. But I also want us perhaps to have a dialogue with the other speakers next week about different notions of cosmopolitanism in different periods, and also in different areas. And I think from my own point of view, what's interesting about cosmopolitanism, it's something which is always universal, aspiring by definition towards the universal, towards the world, but also can never be separated between its local, national and historical definitions and connotations. So there's always what some might call a protective negotiation, others might call a tension, depending on your point of view. You might be interested in Alexander Beecroft's point of view about nationalism and cosmopolitanism in his book, Ecology of World Literature. And I'll start by saying a few words about some of the origins of fin de siècle cosmopolitanism in the French context. And the first person I want to talk about is Madame de Staël. Madame de Staël writing effectively with the legacy of the Enlightenment, into the time of the Republic, as we know, eventually going into exile. And Madame de Staël essentially was a spokesperson for a view of French literature which was very open to taking influences. Madame de Staël was interested in essentialist views of literature, what she saw as southern and northern. And what she liked particularly about this view of European literature was if you took someone like Rousseau, who happened to be Swiss, was able to combine these elements of the northern and the Mediterranean or Latinate types of literature. Rousseau himself was interested in the concept of cosmopolitanism, but also was rather ambivalent about it, wondering, as many have after him, about what it really means when you try and put it into practice. But Madame de Staël is an interesting antidote towards some of the more nationalist views of literature. And also at the same time you see a writer such as Stendhal, who will emphasise the importance of cosmopolitanism as what's seen as an esprit ouvert, opening your mind up to the other possibilities. And this is a legacy we see throughout the 19th century. We think particularly of Romanticism, how Romanticism draws on German philosophy. Think of a figure like Baudelaire and how he draws on people like Hoffmann and Poe. But when we get to the fin de siècle, it becomes very specific. And I'll start perhaps by thinking about Ernest Renan's famous essay on What is a Nation from 1882, his speech. And of course, he's interested in the nation, and he doesn't talk explicitly about the notions of cosmopolitan or universal, but he does talk about the limitations of nationalism, which implies the value of some alternative idea. And in the 1880s in particular, you get a lot of openness towards other literatures. You see a fascination and a fashion for the Russian novel, for example, and arguments that the Russian novel gives something which the French novel can't. The Russian novel has a certain mysticism. You also see an interest in Scandinavian literature, even in British literature. For example, George Eliot is cited, who is perhaps someone who has more sympathy than Zola. But then you get a backlash towards that view. And when you get to the 1890s, here you see a certain protectionism coming in. Think about Maurice Barrès and an article from 1892 about the quarrel of nationalists and cosmopolitanisms. And like so many of these literary quarrels, I think this one is rather inflated. It's more really a question of nuance But there is a certain sense of protectionism, and this feeds into the nationalism around the same time as the Dreyfus affair. And you see certain critics becoming more conservative and effectively saying, why do we need to look outside? Why do we need to look towards cosmopolitanism where we have in our own literature everything we need in our own heritage? So it's a particularly retrogressive and conservative point of view, but also you get very specific French connotations, negatively ones of anti-Semitism, where cosmopolitan also becomes a coded word for a Jew, something which you still see in contemporary French discourse. And also you see a very interesting idea, even those people who espouse a positive view of French cosmopolitanism, that somehow the universal is always French. It's Cartesian, it's Republican, it's based on these universal ideas, but these universal ideas which are inseparably French. So those are the types of things that I'm going to be talking about next week, and I should be very happy to answer questions or develop any of them, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all virtually very much. Thank you for listening.